Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive right into how a single chaotic day back in 1914 completely rewrote modern history. We're going to trace a global chain reaction to really break down one of the most unbelievable series of events in human existence. It is a wild story of empires, massive blunders, and a few seconds that literally shattered the world as they knew it. So let's kick things off with a pretty fascinating question. Can a wrong turn actually change the world? When we look back at these huge, monumental historical shifts, we usually just assume they were driven by massive, unstoppable forces. But as we'll see today, the destiny of billions of people hung on something as incredibly simple and honestly as human as an imperial driver just getting lost on a summer morning. Picture this. The scene is set on June 28, 1914. It's a gorgeous, sunny morning in Sarajevo, which is this beautiful city nestled right in the Dinaric Alps. But beneath all that scenic beauty, the political tension is just incredibly volatile. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is parading through the city with his wife, Sophie. Now, the massive misstep here is the date itself. June 28th was Vidovdan, or St. Vitus's Day. This was a profoundly sacred day of mourning and fierce patriotic pride for Serbian nationalists, remembering a historic battle they'd lost centuries earlier. So for a foreign imperial ruler to parade through Sarajevo on this specific day, it was seen as an absolute intolerable provocation. And waiting in the crowd, just blending right into the sunny scene, were 6 young assassins, armed with bombs, pistols, and cyanide. What happens next honestly plays out like a dark comedy of errors. First off, an assassin throws a bomb, but it literally bounces off the folded fabric roof of the Archduke's convertible and explodes under the car behind them. Then, the assassin swallows a cyanide pill, but it's expired. It only gives him a severe stomachache, and he throws himself into a river that's, get this, barely 4 inches deep. So the Archduke actually survives the morning, and he furiously alters his schedule, deciding to go visit the wounded officers in the hospital. But incredibly, nobody bothers to tell the driver the new route. The driver takes a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street. Realizing his mistake, he hits the brakes, tries to reverse, and the heavy engine stalls directly in front of Schiller's delicatessen. And by absolute terrifying coincidence, one of the original assassins, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, had just stopped at that exact deli to buy a sandwich. The stalled car was sitting barely 5 feet away from him. In the blink of an eye, those next few chaotic seconds turn the situation intensely human and tragic. Princip steps forward and fires twice. One bullet struck the Archduke in the neck, the other hit his wife, Sophie, in the abdomen. As Sophie collapsed, the Archduke pleaded with her, saying, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." When his officers asked if he was in pain, he just kept whispering, "Es ist nichts," which translates to, "It is nothing. It is nothing." By 11 a.m., they were both gone. The profound irony of this whole assassination really lies in the victim himself. On one hand, you have Gavrilo Princip, right? A radical driven by this fiery desire to spark a South Slav revolt against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But his target, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was actually a moderate. He was a champion of something called trialism, which was a plan to give the Slavic populations an equal, autonomous voice within the empire. So Princip assassinated the very man whose moderate reforms threatened to pacify the Slavic population. Because if you think about it, to a radical who wants a full-blown revolution, a moderate reformer is pretty much the most dangerous enemy you can have. Okay, now watch how incredibly fast the dominoes fall from here. Austria-Hungary uses the assassination to hand an impossible ultimatum to Serbia, and they're backed up by a blank check of military support from Germany. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the shooting, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. And this just triggers Europe's geopolitical tripwires. Russia mobilizes to protect Serbia. Germany declares war on Russia. Then Germany declares war on France, marching straight through neutral Belgium to get there, which in turn forces Great Britain to declare war on Germany. In just a matter of weeks, a single shooting pulled the entire European continent into a catastrophic global war. The crucial point we really have to grasp here is the staggering, unprecedented scale of human loss that resulted from this chain reaction. The European powers were expecting a quick, sort of romanticized 19th century war. Instead, they marched right into the industrial slaughterhouse of trench warfare, facing machine guns, poison gas, and heavy artillery. By the time this conflict finally ended, an estimated 20 million soldiers and civilians were dead. Take a moment to really let that number sink in. 20 million lives, totally extinguished. all because of the events set in motion on that one single morning in Sarajevo. But, the physical destruction of the Great War, that was honestly just the beginning. The geopolitical shockwaves were about to fundamentally rewire the entire globe. The war dismantled old autocracies that had ruled over Europe and the Middle East for centuries, totally clearing away the old world order and violently constructing the modern one that we know today. The macro consequences of this were just staggering. We're talking about 4 massive empires being swept right off the map. The exhausted Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, which paved the way for the Bolsheviks to seize power and birth the Soviet Union. The German Empire fell into the fragile and chaotic Weimar Republic. The centuries-old Austro-Hungarian Empire totally dissolved into a giant jigsaw puzzle of new nation-states. And the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled for hundreds of years, was abolished entirely, birthing modern Turkey. The global balance of power was permanently changed. Now, one of those new nations to emerge from the wreckage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was Yugoslavia. So Gavrilo Princip's dream of a unified South Slav state actually came true. But this dream of independence, it came at an absolutely unfathomable cost. 60%. That is the estimated percentage of its entire male population that Serbia lost during the war. To put that into perspective, they paid for their dream of independence with an unimaginable bloodbath that wiped out more than half of a generation. Meanwhile, over in the Middle East, the fall of the Ottoman Empire created a massive power vacuum, and European diplomats just rushed right in, making directly conflicting promises. Trying to gain allies, the British promised the Arabs a unified, independent kingdom, but simultaneously, they issued the Balfour Declaration, which promised Zionists a national home in Palestine. And if that wasn't enough, behind closed doors, British and French diplomats drafted the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement to simply carve up and partition the region between themselves. So the end result was a map literally redrawn by the victorious powers. They drew artificial borders right across the desert, totally ignoring historical, ethnic, and sectarian realities. Iraq was stitched together from 3 distinct, often conflicting provinces. Syria and Lebanon were placed under French control, and Palestine was put under British administration. So when we look at the deeply rooted sectarian conflicts in the Middle East today, we're looking directly at the geographical legacy of a war sparked all the way back in Sarajevo. Across the Atlantic, the war forced an incredible transformation for the United States. Before 1914, the U.S. was largely isolationist, and it was actually a debtor nation, relying heavily on European capital. But by supplying the Allied powers with food, materials, and munitions, and then eventually entering the war to break the stalemate on the Western Front, the dynamic totally flipped. Europe's wealth basically flowed right into American vaults. By 1918, the U.S. had transformed into a global superpower and the world's largest creditor. The blueprint for the American century had officially been written. But perhaps the absolute darkest legacy of 1914 was the failure of the peace that followed. The Treaty of Versailles, signed exactly 5 years to the day after the assassination, was frankly a disaster. It pleased virtually no one. It stripped Germany of its territory, demanded astronomical financial reparations, and forced them to accept full blame for the war via the infamous war guilt clause. So rather than establishing any kind of lasting peace, it really just sowed the seeds for an even greater nightmare down the road. If you trace the historical dots through the 20th century, you can clearly see the century-long echoes of that single gunshot. The humiliation and economic ruin of Versailles paved the way for Adolf Hitler and the rise of fascism. World War II, in many ways, just became the unfinished business of World War I. Meanwhile, that Bolshevik victory in 1917 set the stage for the decades-long Cold War between Western capitalism and Soviet communism. And tragically, in the 1990s, when Yugoslavia collapsed, ethnic cleansing and brutal warfare returned to the very same streets of Sarajevo, where the Archduke had died. The ghosts of 1914 had never truly been laid to rest. To ground this massive, sweeping global history back down to a deeply human level, let's look at the fate of the assassin himself. Gavrilo Princip was actually too young to be executed under the law at the time, so instead he was sent to a maximum security fortress. He died there in April 1918 from tuberculosis and bone rot, with his arm amputated, weighing barely 80 pounds. But before he died, he scratched this incredibly defiant poem right into the wall of his dark cell. Our shadows will wander through Vienna, hover about the court, and make the lords tremble. And, by the time he died, his words had pretty much come true. The empire was crumbling, and millions were in their graves. Which brings us to our final thought. The story of the Sarajevo spark really forces us to step back and ask, is history just an inevitable wave? Is it driven by grand designs and vast geopolitical structures that were always meant to fall? Or is the story of modern civilization incredibly fragile? Did the entire 20th century, with all of its incredible triumphs and its unprecedented horrors, truly just hang on a misunderstood driving route, a jammed gear stick, and a few seconds of blind chance outside a delicatessen? It's a chilling question, and it certainly makes you look at the world around you just a little bit differently, doesn't it?
Please like and subscribe.